Hello, hello. I guess it's about 7 o'clock, so I guess we'll go ahead and get started here. Thanks for coming to tonight's Austin Mobile and Web Game Developers Meetup. It's great to, as always, to see so many people here interested in hearing about these topics. Just for maybe anyone who's new or hasn't come before, essentially these meetups are about kind of giving people an informal setting to discuss things that they've tried and maybe games that they've worked on, things that worked well for them, problems that they had. And we really want it to be sort of a conversation, so if you have anything that you want to ask a question during the talk, feel free to interject, raise your hand, and say something that you think might add to it. Otherwise, we'll have some time at the end for Q&A as well. If you have like a more substantial thing that's maybe off on a tangent, you can kind of save it until the end. I guess thanks definitely to our sponsor. Again, this time this talk is sponsored by Autodesk. So they have a piece of software called Maya LT, which is it's like the version of Maya that's created specifically for indie game developers and mobile game developers and web game developers. So it's a lot cheaper than the full-blown package, but it does like 99% of, I guess, what they feel like people who are developing those kind of games would need. So certainly, if you need like 3D modeling or animation kind of package, feel free to check that out. Another thing that we usually do at the beginning of each of these events is we go around the room and give people a chance to say if they're interested in hiring someone for a particular position related to game development, or if they're wanting to collaborate with people on a project or whatever, looking for a particular thing. Feel free to stand up and say what it is you're looking for. Now would be the time. Anybody have anything on that front?
I do.
Oh, great. Go ahead and say who you are.
I'm looking for a guy just like you.
So you're not looking anywhere.
He just stopped working for us because he's got a new thing, which is great. Congratulations, Peter.
Yeah.
So we're looking for, describe yourself.
Well, I was doing Flash and kind of a mixture, kind of a technical artist position.
Technical artist, yeah. Very talented, this guy. So, So anyway, yeah, art and Flash, Photoshop, that sort of thing. So,
And you're with?
Midnight Studios.
Okay. All right. And what do y'all do just for everybody's benefit? I've definitely been to your website.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
yeah.
That's nice. It's a terrible website. We're working on that.
Ah, that's good.
We are, well, what are we doing? We're kind of in the casino space right now,
Okay.
but everybody needs, to pay the bills.
Yeah.
So casino space, I heard you guys. So, but we got some other things, internal development stuff going on. So sort of actually.
Have they legalized real gambling over the internet?
No,
Okay, all right. I'm just wondering. I mean, I didn't think they did.
We're actually contracting in that whole space of casino games, Las Vegas, and where it is legal in actual casinos.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So we're actually contracting with another company to do stuff.
Cool.
So not real exciting, but games.
No, it's cool. Anyone else? Any other?
Yeah, so I'm a product manager for a small company here. We make social casino games for the iOS App Store. So we've got about 5 games up there, and we are trying to become the first Bitcoin accepting casino in the iOS store. So I'm here looking for people that are interested in Bitcoin, interested in casino, and that understand app space, share ideas, and advisors.
So developers or artists or all of the above, like.
All of the above. We've got our development team, but always great to start a conversation and then see where else it can go.
Cool. Thanks.
Gordon Walton, looking for a server programmer for regular games. No casinos involved.
Yeah.
And I prefer to have a Unity background along with being able to do C++.
Cool. Yeah.
I'm doing a startup project, and I'm looking for people who are interested in MMORPG gaming, and like people who have experience with that. And yeah, I'm looking for a co-founder and like a CTO essentially.
All right. Great. Awesome. Thanks. Anyone else? All right. Well, thanks for all that. And I guess one final note before we get to our speaker for today. We are going to have other events coming up in the next few months where it'll be kind of a community show and tell kind of format. We had one of those, I guess, at the last meetup, and it was sort of a chance for a few different people to get up and give shorter talks, maybe anywhere from like 5 to 20 minutes or something in that range. Even if you have something you're working on that's not fully fleshed out, but you just kind of want to share your progress or kind of get people's feedback or some small lesson learned or whatever, definitely get in touch with me. You can come up and talk to me after if you have some ideas that you would want to talk about in that kind of format. Yeah, definitely let me know. And I guess, so our speaker for today is John Aris. He has worked on a bunch of stuff. He has a long resume in game development, but I guess specifically today he's going to be talking about kind of shared code that he did between a few, 3 recent games that he worked on that are all actually quite different.
Pretty different, yeah.
So I'm fascinated to hear how he handled that. Yeah, so I guess feel free to take it away.
Okay, so I am John, and this is about trying to share code as much as possible. I mean, I know everybody likes to try and do that. It doesn't usually work very well, but anyway, so my background is basically I've done a lot of stuff. Like basically I started out doing web games and things like that, really casual games before Facebook and stuff like that happened. And then all that happened, I kind of got into doing Facebook games, and then mobile happened, and the company I was at was actually going to start doing, it's called Sneaky Games. They were going to start doing mobile stuff, but I wanted to do like dopey little cute mobile things. They wanted to do like hardcore mobile things. So it was just like, I just wanted to see if I could do it. And so I ended up leaving there and basically making a little game and doing some contracting. And then what happened was actually in January, there's this guy named Jesse Sosa who works at Dinosaur Games. Well, he's now in Brazil. Actually, he's doing some stuff with Android or something like that. Anyway, he wanted me to do some RPG stuff for a game he was working on. And I got sucked back into my long-term project, which is procedurally generated RPGs, essentially. I mean, my whole thing is, if you ever heard of Dwarf Fortress, the kind of thing where you go in and all this weird stuff is happening. Now imagine, if you will, that people could be in, well, maybe not the same shared world, because that's actually harder to do, but imagine there are little pockets of the world where you can go in there and you can change things, and then those kind of get fed into a simulation, and then they kind of get brought out, and everybody can see differences over time, like you've killed a lot of wolves and stuff like that. Anyway, that's kind of my long-term dream project, and I've been working on that for a few months using this code base. But I've done a lot of stuff. I mean, I've done weird telecom games, horse games. I've even done like a demo in something called the Hero Engine for like 2 months, which they built Tor in, basically like playing around with that. That's a very weird system. And actually, somebody was mentioning entity systems. That actually is using the kind of entity kind of a thing, very, very hardcore. So when I started out doing this, I had been working at Sneaky Games, and I was using a lot of Flash and a little bit of C#, .NET for server-side stuff. And so when I left there, I was trying to use Flash, and I'd used PHP before, and I tried all these different things here, basically. And what I was also doing is I was trying to figure out what kind of games I wanted to make, so I had a bunch of ideas for games. One of them is sort of like a combat game where you have 2 towers or people on each side with hit points, and you can sort of like get spells or something like that, and then in the middle, to get your resources, Bejeweled, basically. You get little red things for fire mana, blue things for water mana, whatever that is. And so basically it would be kind of like a Bejeweled, but with combat in it. I kind of like that something X with combat. That's kind of one of the things that I enjoy doing. So another thing was Go, essentially, but you put multiple pieces on the board and it's hexagonal, and you can stack the pieces, but they get more expensive, stuff like that. I mean, I was working on a bunch of little things. So what I settled on was a little game, which is essentially, it's not like Bejeweled. Bejeweled is basically match 3, and everything disappears and you get some points. This is another game called Triple Town, which is a really brilliant game, which I recommend getting. You can get some free versions of it and try it out. Essentially, it's match 3, and the thing turns into something a little bit more powerful. It's actually a really amazingly cool game that's very hard. The only person I've ever heard of in my life who's actually good at it is somebody named Stefan Burra, who's like an amazing game designer. So everybody else, it's just something that's really very cerebral. And so I ended up doing all this stuff. I ended up making the first version of the little game in Xamarin, which is basically a C# mobile cross-platform thing. It's actually not that bad. I mean, one of the problems I had with it is that you can't, so one of the things I wanted to do here is, since I was trying to share code, is I wanted to write server code inside of Visual Studio and use things like AWS and Azure. Okay, and then I wanted to take that exact code, some of that code, and actually stick it into the client somehow. So the problem with Xamarin, at least this is how it was last year, is you actually have to make different projects and essentially add the files by hand into there. I mean, you can do it, but it's not really good. Unity is actually better because you can take Visual Studio .NET DLLs and pull them in. You can actually do F#, some of F#. I mean, not everything like that. There's some weird stuff in there, but it's like 1 or 2 megs of extra DLL, so maybe it's not worth it. But the point is you can pull things in. Their mono is apparently better at dealing with that. Now, another thing when I was starting out, there's the Unreal Engine. This is one of the bigger engines that you use when you have big budgets. That's how it used to be. The licensing used to be, you can make $50,000, then they take 25% of everything. That was too much. But had they had this licensing last year, I might have considered it. I might have been doing everything in C++. So I'm not like wedded to C#. I ended up doing things in C#, but I'm not wedded to it. Okay, it's just happened to be that at the time, I think that was the best option essentially going forward. So like I said, I ended up using Unity 3D and .NET for the server-side components. And I think also, besides the language you're doing, if you're making games, I think it's important to think about what kind of tools and what kind of community there is available. Like Unity has an amazing community because you can use your favorite language, but if there's nothing that's really built out there for making games, you're going to do a lot of work, a lot of really horrible work at the very low level, trying to get that to work. So that was another thing that I wanted to think about. Sorry, this is a little wonky.
Did you start using C# because of Unity?
No, what happened was I tried these things. I actually really wanted to use JMonkey Engine in Java, and I started showing it to people, and people were like, well, I don't want to turn Java on in my browser. And so I was like, I can't do that. So then I went with Xamarin because I wanted to do simple 2D games. And Xamarin's fine. I mean, it's basically just a layer on top of iOS and Android and everything. And they've actually done, I think, a really good job in the past year of making it more cross-platform. Like they have this sort of platform-agnostic UI system now, which is really cool. They didn't have that last year. But anyway, I just went with that because it looked like basically it was cheap and it's really good. I mean, essentially, this is low-budget game development, so it's like I didn't think there was anything else that was actually had as many features and was actually as cheap as it was. So it's price and cost and everything. And then the C# server is basically because I wanted to share code. I mean, like I said, if I had gone with Unreal, I would have been doing C++. It's just basically trying to do that kind of a thing. So these are the 3 games. The first one is Super Cute Animal Rumble. It was originally called Voracious Varmints, but nobody's ever going to search for that. This is the triple tab game where you sort of merge 3 together and they level up. It's like a little war game. You get little armies and you go start attacking people. And it was originally written, like I said, in Xamarin, monotypes, and I switched it over to Unity eventually. The next one is PSA Card Slugger. It's a game that I made for a client, which is basically a baseball card trivia game. Apparently, like I had no idea how big this was, but like baseball cards, signed things, this is actually really big. And these are one of the big players in it. And they wanted a game about baseball cards. So I ended up writing that. And then Gen RPG is kind of my dream game. It's not going to be like a full-on MMO. I mean, I don't think you can make a full-on MMO as a single person, but it is going to have, you basically go into a zone, procedurally generates the zone, loads the monsters based on some kind of world state, and then you kind of run around and do stuff, and as you kill things or as you do quests, those get fed into a central world simulation, and it suddenly updates things like, oh, we've killed a lot of wolves here, so there aren't going to be as many wolves appearing, stuff like that. So basically it's an RPG, but the things you do are going to affect what other people see eventually. It's not like a real-time kind of a thing, but like you'll see that if there's some kind of reward for attacking a village, you'll probably come back the next day and you'll see the village destroyed or something like that. And the other kind of thing is, maybe you have like elves that are living there and then the orcs attack it. You'll eventually see the orcs going in there. The idea is that I want to tell stories basically, and I think the way to do that is procedural content. Because, okay, this is like the weirdest I'm going to get, hopefully, this talk. But basically, a story to me is the meaning you give to events. So you have to have a bunch of events to get a story. An event is a change in a world state. A change in world state that the computer does is procedural content. I consider AI to be procedural content. I mean, if you have something here and it goes here, it's now in a new state, and that's still a type of procedural content. So in the same way, if you had like an orc house, and now you have an elf house or something like that, that's still the kind of procedural content you have. So it's trying to basically balance that. That's going to take a long time to do. We'll see how that goes. And I'm going to actually just show you some of this. This is Super Cute Animal Rumble. This is the little Triple Town game.
And that works just a
Yeah, that didn't go. Why didn't that go? That's weird.
That's on iOS and on
Yeah, and on Android.
And yeah.
Yeah.
That's cool.
It's actually weird. Sometimes these games don't load everything correctly inside of Mac OS. It's weird. I don't understand why that is. Sometimes it just don't load everything correctly on Macs, and I don't really test on Macs that much, unfortunately. So that's the thing. Let me just give you an idea. So you have these little things here, like you have a little 1 here, little 2s here. You can see that if I put 3 2s next to each other, all of a sudden, boom, it's a 3. That kind of stuff. And so if you come down here, these are actually really small to see, but if we look at this down here, you can see down here, this has like 110 health and like a little bit of damage. This has like 209, and then this has 397, is that one? I can't even read that anymore, weird font. Anyway, the point is that these things increase in power over time. And there's also the ability to challenge people online if you're logged in through Facebook or email. There is a local version of this. One thing I try to do for the simple games is basically give people a local version of the game they can play without ever signing in and logging in. Now they can do everything except for playing other people, essentially. Like they can play against the computer all they want. There's actually also a hot seat kind of mode where you can play against somebody else on the same couch next to you, stuff like that. So, but basically I like to have that so you can actually play it, although it does actually download data from the server, when you look at it. So this is this game here. This is the game I made. I hadn't done very well, made a little tiny bit of money off it, but I realized what happened was I don't really like to do marketing, and I realized after sending like 20 or 30 emails and getting ignored that this probably wasn't going to happen, and I realized that I don't get to actually have my own company and do it myself because I'm not willing to basically go up against that wall. I'm not willing to do that day after day. I mean, programming, I can just do that all day. I'm willing to go and sit there and beat my head against that wall all day, but marketing, basically just having people ignore you over and over, I can't deal with that. So that's what I found out, unfortunately. I don't usually develop on this computer also. This is basically for building the iOS and then debugging it. And then I go back to my lovely Windows machine. So this is the baseball card game. Again, it's running on a lot of the same kinds of code. I mean, it has different UI pieces and stuff like that, but believe it or not, there are a lot of screens in here that are actually based on some of the same code that was being generated. So the idea is basically you click pitch, and then it goes to their computer, and they have like 30,000 cards, and then they go and pick a random card, then they show you the card. I have no idea who this is. So I'm just going to pick this person, and I was out because that didn't work. Oh, yep. So basically I lost. Basically that's it. So, but this is the idea. Basically, they wanted a card. They basically wanted something because that's what they do. This company is the company that. Well, there's actually 2 companies that basically are in the business of verifying that signatures on baseballs and baseball cards and all this other stuff are actually correct. This is one of the big companies. They wanted something basically to show off their catalog. It's actually interesting. So, we were going to originally save games to let people see them, but it turns out people started. The way I did that is I didn't want to have to write like thousands of rows into the database or something like that every time. So I was just serializing the objects, essentially, the recording of the game. But it got too big, so we had to take that out. But it was fascinating that there are things in here, like the modern players. I mean, literally, the people playing this game could get thousands of things in a row correct. It's so scary. That is hardcore. I mean, it's like, and there's like 20 or 30,000 cards. I mean, you have to know like the person, the year, all this other, it's crazy. The questions are also like, what company made it, all this other kind of stuff. What's the card number? They all have card numbers, and they're getting those kinds of things right. So anyway, it's pretty crazy. So that's an interesting experience in there.
So this is tied into the National Baseball League, whatever that's called. So,
I don't think they're officially part of it. They're not part of like the National League, American League, or anything. But they're not part of that Major League Baseball. But
the cards themselves, I mean, those are like licensed.
well, the cards, yeah, the card companies do that, like the Tops and all that kind of stuff. Those companies have to get licenses. And then once they're out there, there's several card companies, and these basically they just sort of it's a collector. I mean, it's like stamp collecting. It's like stamp collecting or coin collecting or whatever it is, except you can get signatures and stuff like that. So just something else. They're like comic book collecting or something like that. So that's essentially what they do. Let me show you the other one, which is this is the RPGs. It's very much a work in progress. This is like $20 worth of Unity art. So don't be too harsh. I mean, I always love that when people like do Kickstarters and you can just tell it's like Unity art. It's like, come on, try a little bit. You know, at least get somebody, yeah. So anyway. It's actually the same UI system as Super Cute Animal Rumble. What I actually do is I generate my UIs because Unity has a bad habit of dying when you have giant scenes. It also means that if I want to do a mobile version of a game, I can have totally different rules for making UIs for that, essentially that kind of thing. Because like, normally you're going to have like a landscape, but you probably want to go portrait and like restrict some things and stuff like that. Anyway, we're going to enter the world, hopefully, if I can download something, and you will see over several steps that this thing will start to create itself. And we get little bumps and get mountains here pretty soon. The other kind of stuff. There's a little like towns and locations that'll be in there and stuff like that. Okay, so we come into here. It's a little bit difficult. Sometimes the buttons don't work apparently in Mac OS either, but it's also kind of slow. But anyway, the point is it's like a little 3D thing and you can shoot little bullets at things. There is actually stuff like combat and treasure and things like that. I built out all of these systems in here. It's just very rough. There just isn't a lot of art with it, but there's actually a lot of stuff that's been built in the background over the last few months, just dealing with like items, monsters, quests, zones, all this other kind of stuff in there. It's all just kind of in the background.
Is he throwing baseballs?
He's throwing little meteors. That's like one of the stock Unity things you can get is these little meteors that just something to throw. I don't know. Anyway, that's what that is. I can't actually start Unity for some reason. It's just not working, so I can't show you a version that's less laggy. I'm going to try one more time, maybe. But anyway, those are the three things in there. And so the idea behind the code that I ended up doing was basically because I can pull DLLs from Visual Studio into Unity, the idea is write as much as you can in Visual Studio and then basically leave hooks and things like that. Maybe abstract methods, maybe virtual methods, something like that. Maybe interfaces that you can implement using like a mono behavior in some cases. Whatever you can do to try and keep stuff in. I'm sorry. I've never used, what did I do? That must have been something I did. Okay, so anyway, the whole point is to have a bunch of stuff in here. So basically you have all these things in here that are shared, and it can be done, basically downloaded to the client, and then server side for like the tools and editors and things, it uses all of the shared code and then it adds other things. Like basically, right now I'm actually using Windows Forms essentially for the editor. It's a C# kind of a thing so that I can have all this data in here. So for example, when you generate zones and things like that, there's actually a two-step process. The first step is it makes like a general overview of the world that's going to be used in the world sim, and then when you go down to the client, it actually generates like specific monsters and things like that when it actually makes the world. So in here, I need to have a lot of the world sim code, and I also need to have a lot of it over here. So it's like you have to try and put as much as you can in the middle, and then just have the things that can't be shared in there. And so again, this is basically the connections, like a lot of the things in here, like HTTP, repositories, sockets, stuff like that. I have to basically abstract them out because they work totally different. Like you don't use the same HTTP objects and stuff like that. So I end up having to do that. And also like saving files. Like here, basically, you have no choice but to serialize something to, a string basically, because that's all you have is a dictionary. And up here you can do things with databases and stuff like that. But basically you have to do something to separate that.
You're sharing code between client and server as well as between the various games.
Yes, it actually does work that way. Yeah. So let me actually describe it a little bit. So what happens, well, actually, I'm going to get into it. I'm going to keep going, I guess. I'm going to kind of get into what goes on when you start something up. Okay, so anytime you start a piece of code, this can be a client, server, or an editor, what you have is two pieces of data, two strings, essentially. The first string is I call it game prefix, which is basically if you're making a game or something, you normally make a short string that gives you like a quick, this is the name of this game. Okay, it's just like something, and I use it actually a lot for like Facebook names, app names, inside of the cloud, I use it to name certain kinds of folders and things like that. I use it all over the place to basically say that this is what's with this game. There's some configuration in there. You can override the configuration to basically change some of these things. Like for example, I had to change the name from Voracious Farm. It's a super cute animal rumble, but basically this is the idea. There's some setup here that basically all of these things, like you have to do like iOS, Android, Facebook, the cloud, your own files, things like that. Like when I start doing naming things, I do have to do some code copying. For example, there's like a sort of like a base character class that deals with like loading and saving. Well, I generally prefix that, so I have like Slugger character service or Gen RPG character service or whatever that is. So I end up doing some prefixing and stuff like that, and some abstract generic classes that basically hold that. And then the environment. Currently, I have 3 environments. Dev is like your computer. Test is something that people can see, and it's also generally you don't want people looking at it, but it just depends on how you do that. Like for example, you can make it basically hidden, except you can just connect to it from iOS and Android. Like if you don't put it on Facebook, it just be like thing you connect to from iOS and Android, and then live is going to be the live version, as it were. So the idea is, as far out as possible, I want to load the game prefix in the environment. Okay, so what this means is if I do that, then I can go into this code, and I can hopefully share more. And I actually just want to show you a little bit of this. Let me see, trunk. Code. I think this is the idea. Of course, this isn't going to work now. What is wrong with this? Something with... I don't know. It's just slow. And you're not... Okay, this is just slow. I guess the Xamarin Studio is a little slow. So the idea is this is actually the main entry point to... The main entry point to the game. And this is, any client can be built this way. Essentially, this is very agnostic in terms of what is going to happen here. So you come in here, this is actually uncommented, so I could connect to the test server to show you, but it didn't work. The main thing about this is that there's this thing called setup client servers. You can see that it takes this game state object and the game prefix in the environment. The point is that every game can be built this way because these things are going to be set into there, and that's where you start actually setting up like your services and other kinds of things like that. And so everything in there comes out of that. But the point is, at this point, this is actually agnostic. And this actually has a point in here. This is one of the things I generally do, is once I go into sort of the agnostic function, basically, or the agnostic class to look these things up, I generally have a specific class that I look up using reflection inside of there, so I don't actually have to have it out here. And it just looks it up using the name. So it means that this thing can actually start up any of the clients, essentially. And like most of the stuff happens in here, and it sort of specializes itself inside of that function there. So let me see. So that's sort of like the client, and then basically the servers and things are actually generally running on Azure. I tried AWS, but it was actually too much stuff to upload when you want to upload something from .NET. Like you have to upload IIS. At least that's how it was like a year or two ago. So I just went, okay, I'm just going to go use Azure because that's the Microsoft thing, and they generally make that easier on you. So that ends up there. So in those things, essentially, they have all these, in .NET programs and stuff like that, they have all kinds of configuration files, app.config, web.config, anyway. There's also an azure.config. So for the query server, which like for logging in and for the asynchronous games and stuff like that, those are actually all running off the same web role. Essentially what I'm doing is I have a command interpreter instead of having like a REST service, with this URL, that URL, that URL. So you end up sending serialized commands up, they get processed, they come back, and then there's a handler that deals with like whatever results you have in there. But the web role is the same for all the games essentially. So it's like the difference is really sticking a few little constants inside of a file, and then like certificates and stuff like that for specific games. They all have different certificates for everything and all that kind of stuff. There's some configuration you have to do, but the point is that the web role itself is actually the same code. It does the same kind of a thing here, where basically you go in and it knows what game it is and what environment it is, and it'll set itself up correctly for that game and environment. So you don't, so it goes in there and deals with all that stuff itself. Okay. And then the editors, so the editor is actually one editor for all the games. Essentially, you get a little pop-up that's like, pick your game, and then you get a list of commands that are like, dev users, live users, whatever, make a new world, like update Facebook achievements, all these other kinds of things for each game. But again, it does the same kind of a thing where you pass these two things in and it knows what it's supposed to do, and then it kind of goes forward from there with that. All right, so yeah, some of the stuff that I like to do is try and use shared source code as much as possible. I mean, I know it's everybody wants to do that, but it doesn't usually work very well. In Unity, I like to use small scenes because Unity just has a habit of just not working. Like the scenes just stop working, and it's like, what are you going to do? So since I love procedural content generation, I'm going to generate my UIs. I'm going to basically load things in, and if I have if I were doing say static fixed scenes and things like that, I would probably have them built separately and have them sort of in a minimalist way, saved down the disk somehow, like serialize, the dungeon shape with the monsters and all that, and not actually have a scene in there, but then kind of load that up and rehydrate everything inside of there dynamically, just because it's just things just happen for some reason in Unity scenes, and I don't know. Anyway, that's just a preference here. Well, thank God I like procedural content generation, so I don't have to make giant levels usually, stuff like that. I like to think about the 90% case. Basically, there's a lot of stuff for certain kinds of games, which are games where you don't have much player-to-player interaction, where you don't have to worry so much about having like a real database, a real relational database and stuff like that. The thing about that is I tend to use serialized objects or things because they're actually pretty small in general. And the thing is that on the client, if you're going to store stuff, you have to serialize anyways to save stuff, and there's no database there. So I tend to do that, but there are a lot of places where I don't use it. For example, like for analytics and stuff, you throw it out into a big NoSQL thing where you sort of like tell oh, this user logged in this many times starting on this date and all this kind of junk, and then what did they do? If you start talking about interplayer interactions, like in an MMO, like you're going to trade between players, you really have to be very careful about that using SQL and transactions to make sure it either all happens or it doesn't happen. Okay, but if the player is just like siloed by themselves, or if they're very light player-to-player interactions, it's not as important really to deal with. At least that's what I found. And actually, in the car game, that's actually really, if you know what like WCF and service references and SQL Server and all that is, that's actually the back end of that. So that's actually using that. And the thing is, it still uses the same simple interface, which is effectively, a dictionary. Essentially, it's a load, save, and delete is like the core of it. And so you just put whatever you want behind that. So you have different repository factories, and you can just throw what you want behind that. But in general, for a complete game, like one of these games here, generally speaking, the client has a repository factory that makes little things that serialize the disk. I think I just used player preferences or something like that. And then on the server side, you're sending things out to the cloud, like Azure, essentially just storing them out there in Azure. And like this thing at the bottom is a thing that I asked myself just to try and get as much as I can out of this. So thinking in terms of, a little board game versus an RPG, is there anything that's similar there? Is there anything in the client server that's similar there? And I just try and use that as a starting point for figuring out what I'm going to do. And it doesn't always work out, of course, but it's basically that kind of an idea. Like, I just try and think about multiple projects, multiple parts of the project as a starting point for building abstractions and stuff like that. So, now this is not actually using object-oriented. So what I'm actually doing is I have parallel hierarchies for data and code. I'm using sort of like an anemic data model with services in here. So what that means is that I can look at my data by itself and basically deal with that separately and then pass that data into the services and do things with it. So, but I do have inheritance and things like that. So what happens is, like for example, if you have like a game object, this thing that stores the game itself, like the board game, like where are all the pieces in there, what are the conditions of the piece, all that kind of junk, all that's stored in the game object. And you basically have this cascading thing of where we're going to have an I game for the most general code and then a base game inside of the, generally they're abstract generic base classes, like I said down there, because it just happens that that's like the easiest way for me to think about this. And same thing with the logic and stuff like that. It ends up being generally an interface with an abstract generic base class and then some kind of implementation class in there. And so what this also means that if I make a new game, I do have some work to do to make new concrete classes, but I could look at the previous game and basically get a good start on it and basically figure out, well, I need these 5 and these 5 here. And it's like, you know, the game prefix, it essentially comes down to changing the game prefix and all of those things. And that's like a good start on a new thing. And so I can do that. Mono behaviors, I use a little tiny bit of inheritance, not much because really it's components, you're not supposed to do that, but I do use a little bit of it. One thing is that the tutorial system is actually data driven, which I didn't show you in here, but the idea is I want to be able to intercept the click. If you click something, I want to know, are you in a tutorial, yes or no? If no, all right, fine. If you are, yes. Are you in a state where you can click that or not? So basically, I don't know how y'all do tutorials. I've done them in horrible, horrible ways. But this is actually data-driven, and it actually like intercepts things like that. And the price is you have a little bit of inheritance in the component system, and I'm like, all right, I can live with that. So, you know, I can deal with that. And the other thing is like a UI handler or a view handler, whatever you want. There is something on every screen, like you saw the pop-up, like new game, all that kind of stuff. Each of those I call them screens. I mean, I know they're like views or whatever thing people actually, you know, they call them in different formats. Anyway, the point is there is code that handles that basically says show this screen, don't show that screen, all that kind of stuff. So essentially in the show method, you get a single object you can pass in, so you can actually do as much as you want configuration, you know, in terms of showing the screen. If you wanted to show something weird, like an example, maybe in an RPG, you would like show a character's portrait or like, you know, the 3D character or something, but if you pass in another character that's not you, you'd be able to see them. That kind of a thing where you can customize this a little bit. But I didn't make that really too complicated. And so again, like I said, I ended up separating code and data essentially into 2 different hierarchies here, and they grow with each other in parallel. And kind of go from there. All right, so in terms of how the interaction actually works between client and server, so it doesn't use a REST service in the sense of having 50 different URLs that you go to and do things. It actually uses a command interpreter or command parser. And the reason for that is actually I worked at a place called Sneaky Games, and essentially we had the Farmville clone. And the problem with that is you would send commands to the server, but it would be really expensive to actually do all this stuff. So what happens is, essentially, you can queue up as many commands as you want, whatever you want to do, send it to the server. The server's going to load out like the core data that you have, process all of the commands, and if they're all okay, it'll save you back to the database. You can end up having like fewer calls to this. And the thing is that I don't have to worry about a lot of different URLs and things like that. So it's a really kind of a weird way if you're doing it from web stuff. But this is like back from when I was doing MUDs. I mean, you'd have a telnet connection or a TCP connection. You just send up commands and they would just get interpreted. You know, whatever you send, they would just get interpreted. So it's just like a different kind of a way to do that. And also on the client, in a lot of cases, when you click a button, as soon as possible, I try and get out of the client code and go back into the shared code as much as possible and start doing the logic in there. It just makes life easier for me to deal with. It's a lot easier to test it. I haven't tested everything in here, but the shared code is a lot easier to test. And it actually, the abstractions in terms of getting rid of the database and stuff like that actually make that a lot easier because you can just swap that out with like a dictionary, essentially, an implementation of a dictionary. And actually for storing the data and things like that, essentially there is a thing called a game state. This is essentially a thing where when you're doing the command processing, essentially you get your user data, you have the shared metadata, which is only created once per session, once per, I guess, server load. And actually maybe it regenerates itself every 20 minutes or so. And then you have these services essentially in there that you can use to figure out what you're going to do. And so the game state, like I said, it contains user data and shared data. It does contain a service locator. I did not use constructor injection and actual DI for this because the client doesn't work that well and I'd rather have a consistency. It does make it a little bit harder to test, but the client is much more consistent with the way the server works. So, I mean, this is a trade-off. This is one of the big trade-offs. Then the repository factory goes there, and essentially in the server side, the repository factory is either Azure or AWS. And on the client, it essentially wraps player preferences and lets you serialize things out to player preferences and stuff like that. And then the Azure AWS side, you can do whatever you want. I mean, they have like blob, table, SQL, whatever you want. There's all kinds of stuff you can do on that side. And there's also a small mediator, and this is another thing about that. Now, I know a lot of people like mediators, and I've actually tried using mediators before, and it worked on a pretty small project. But for me anyways, the level of indirection, like it just gets too hard for me to understand. I mean, at a certain point, there's a certain complexity of like, send this message, send that message, and you have all these messages, and it's like, I would rather have an object there, like an interface. And yes, with an interface, you may have to look in 2 or 3 places to figure out what it's doing. But like with the mediator and event passing, where you're doing everything that way, it just gets too complex for me. So although I've tried that before, I didn't do that for this. So for example, the mediator in here is used for simple things that basically don't have side effects, like logging. So one nice thing about this is, inside of the shared code, I could write code that when it's run on the client will call debug.log, but on the server it won't do anything. That kind of stuff, or maybe it sends out to some other kind of error thing. No, actually I don't think debug.log is generally only for client, but the point is that it's just a way to get a little bit of functionality, extra functionality inside of the shared code that only the client is supposed to have in there. And so that's essentially that kind of an idea in here. This goes in there. And so the punchline for this, and I guess I'm maybe done a little early, the punchline for this is, one of the things is that in games you have to prototype a lot and you have to rapidly do different things. So although I'm using a statically typed language, which is kind of a pain in the ass to deal with, because of the way this is set up, if you have something that's a piece of data that you're going to serialize into Azure AWS, then what you can do is you can just add it into one of the data classes in Visual Studio, and then you can go into the editor, restart the editor. That's going to have it in there. The editor actually uses reflection to generate most of the editing scenes. Now, some of them don't. Like, for example, colors. Colors, you have little sliders and a little color square and stuff like that, because you can't really edit colors. But a lot of the data things, it just uses reflection, where you can basically go down through the hierarchy. It requires you to understand how it works, but because you can replace certain of those things with different things, if you really want to, like the color thing, then I figure it's good enough to start with and do that. And so you do that, you save in the editor, you edit that field, and you save it to the cloud. Then you restart the game server, and essentially that will load that data in. It has a new in-memory, it'll pull that data from the cloud, it'll send down to the client. Now, if you restart the client then, and let's say you want to display that data, during the build process for the server, it'll actually copy the new DLLs into Unity. And so Unity will have access to that. So you can go into Unity and maybe just like show that int somewhere on the UI or something like that. But I mean, the net effect of this is that for a lot of things, especially during prototyping, essentially you can add an int in one spot and it'll work all the way from your database down to the client, essentially. I mean, that's the thing, including in the editor generating itself. So this is like rapid prototyping, and then later on, if you need to change things to something else, if you need to make it SQL or something, just change the way it's being stored, like run a process where you pull things out and then you change them, you make a bunch of different rows in a table that you did, and then basically save that kind of an idea. So anyway, that's kind of the idea behind it. It's just basically trying to make it so that I have a lot of shared code, but then I specialize what I'm doing in each game, in each environment, and to make it so I can do this kind of a thing, which is essentially get around the fact that I have a statically typed language, and for the most part be able to use it and just quickly change the data structures and things like that, so that I can just try a lot of stuff. I mean, basically that's what it comes down to. You don't want to be trying to make a game and like, oh, we have to go talk to the database people and the tools people and the client people and all this other kind of junk. You just don't want to do that. I mean, as much as possible you want to try and do this. You can't do everything with this, certainly, and like as your team scales up, this sort of stuff isn't going to actually work as well. You have to do some other things to deal with it, but like for most small projects and stuff like that, there just isn't that much data. And if they're very siloed data and you can separate out your analytics and your logging and stuff like that, then you really don't need to do, in my opinion anyway, you don't need to put everything in SQL. You don't need to do that as much, and it just goes faster. And like I said, if you want to eventually put it in SQL, you just do that at some point. And anyway, that's basically the idea behind this, I guess. So yeah, it's a little weird, but that's how it is. So any questions, comments?
What NoSQL did you use?
It's actually the internal Azure table storage for now. I'm just using that. I'm not going overboard with using a lot of things. That's one of the reasons why I used Azure. I mean, AWS, again, AWS is harder to deal with, but that's one of the reasons why I know people like to use a lot of different tools. I tend to like taking the tools I have and sort of stretching them to see what they can do first, and if they break, then I'll do something else with it. But the table storage they have is okay. You don't have multiple indexes. So for example, the user data actually is one of the things that has to be searched. So what I end up doing is I end up having multiple rows inside of the table storage. And each of those rows is essentially an index for a different thing. Like if you have a user stored, you might have 5 rows stored. The first one is like an ID index and an email index and a name index and stuff like that. So you have all these different indexes separated. But something like table storage, essentially it's like 10 million transactions for $1 on table storage or something like that. And if you put this key in front, this thing I call the partition key, if you make those all very different, and I actually end up, like when you sign up and you come in with like your email or like your Facebook ID, I tend to take that string and I tend to hash it. So you end up with very random strings. So it's basically a very scalable thing, and it is cheap, essentially, simple to use. But yeah, I have actually used Mongo a little bit, but it was a long time ago. It was like a few years ago, I guess, something like that. It was a pain to get that to work and actually stay up, though. It was just, yeah, anyway, it wasn't quite so good. Yeah. Okay, any other kind of questions? Yeah, what's up?
With this whole shared code thing, did you ever feel like the effort you put into making this shared thing, was it just not worth?
I have to say, at this level, I certainly made trade-offs. I mean, I certainly made trade-offs and made some things easier on myself, but I knew I wanted to make multiple games. I knew ultimately I wanted to make this RPG that I wanted to do, and I knew I didn't want to start with that. So, I don't know, I guess it wasn't so bad. I think it's kind of neat, so that's good enough. I mean, I hate this, that's, you know.
What are the downfalls of doing it this way? I mean, you have to sort of predict the future a little bit.
Yeah, so what it is I've just made so many little games. I have an idea of what different games kind of need. I know how much I'm going to have to go in depth and like what the size of the data is going to be and stuff like that. So I don't know what to say. I know starting with a simpler game and basically leaving space. Well, let me give you an example of the complexities differences here. So when I say shared code, I mean, you have to understand, like for the RPG game, there's very little of the shared. It's like the login, like the command processor, all that kind of stuff, and all the database stuff. But then the actual code for the actual gameplay is all very different. So that is part of it, but there's definitely some stuff in there. So let me actually look into this. Domain. Okay. All right, so this is the code for the little animal. This is the specific code for the little animal, the cute animal game where you merge things together. It's like a dozen files. If I can find this. And this is the code for the RPG currently. This is like 120 different classes for the RPG, essentially. Some of these are on the character, some of these are in shared data, some of these are in like world sim data. I mean, there's just a lot of different stuff in here that goes with it. So it's like, it was a starting point, definitely, but it was like basically, I could just kind of tell with the little animal game that there was a lot of stuff that we were gonna have to do, like basic manipulation of data and stuff like that. But it ended up being a lot more work to put in there, but the point is I didn't have to start from nothing. Like I can build these games by going into different Unity scenes right now and build them. I can build the servers by picking different things, different projects in Visual Studio and building them, and they'll build. So that's the thing.
So which one did you do first?
The little animal game first. The RPG is just going to be like a work in progress for a long time. I have the feeling.
Do you find as you progress from game to game that, oh, that's a better idea for this shared piece. Oh, now I have to go back. Because I'm supporting all these games. I got to go back and update.
Yes.
So now you're maintaining all of these.
That is true. That is true, and that has happened sometimes. But because the serialization between client servers pretty agnostic, and it's actually okay. I ended up writing my own serialization code because there wasn't code that did everything I wanted. But the point is, it's resistant to changes and things like that. So when that happens, it's actually not horrible. At least it hasn't been so far, because I can just find in general that means, because almost always these sort of services here generally have implementations for different games, and there's like a shared thing. That means often I can put things back in the shared thing, but that hasn't happened that much. I mean, there has been some adjustments and things like that, but it hasn't been horrible so far. It has to be really obvious if I'm going to do that, I think, to actually go back and do all that. Yeah.
When you first started looking for code to share, were there things that you thought would be really useful that haven't been, or things that you didn't think would be a big deal that have actually proved really reusable?
So let me think about that. The useless stuff. Trying to think. The thing is, for the useless stuff, I'm sure there are things that probably just didn't matter as much. Oh God, but I've kind of blocked that out maybe. With this stuff, I really try and just write it and get it working and everything like that, and then kind of go on for the shared stuff and go on to the next thing. And what was the other part? This is better than you thought, or?
Yeah, like something you didn't think would be a big deal, but you've actually reused.
Oh, okay, serializing the object instead of using a relational database. That, I mean, again, this is not something you can do if you need to do transactions and stuff like that, but for things which are totally siloed, and it's just like you call to the web server, do a couple things, and then save, stuff like that, and the fact that that's exactly the same as what you have to do on the client if you just have local stuff stored, that actually worked better than I thought. I mean, I don't recommend it for everything. You certainly have to look at it. There are definitely places for relational databases, but I think for games like this, which are, there's if you're doing little mobile games, it's a lot of very siloed content, at least something to consider. Okay, that's the other thing. The other part of that is I did end up having to write my own serialization code, because there's certain things I want. For example, I want it to deserialize to the dynamic type, not the static type, so I can have an I list of I foo, and like a foo A, foo B, foo C, and I'll deserialize the foo A, foo B, foo C. Things don't generally do that very well without a lot of hand-holding. I don't want to have a lot of hand-holding. I want it to work on all of the Unity platforms, including Unity iOS with sockets, which is actually pretty restrictive. There was another thing I was using called binary formatter, which doesn't work on that. So I ended up just doing that kind of a thing. But yeah, it's worked pretty well. I mean, it's worked pretty decently, and so it ends up saving some more time than I thought. I mean, that last slide of basically adding the int and basically just having things working when you recompile, that's the only reason I have 120 classes here after 3 or 4 months. Because I can basically go in here and I can work on this, and I don't have to worry about, even though I'm in a statically typed language, I don't have to worry about all of the little details. And I can add things, let's remove that, all that kind of stuff. And the fact that it's not going to deserialize and die means I can do that and try different things and stuff like that. So for prototyping, I think it's been really amazing to just be able to change stuff, essentially sort of like how you would do it in a dynamic language, except it's actually static. So that's one nice thing that's actually been better than I thought it would ever be. So.
And you save development time?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. I mean, I thought this is going to, where I am right now on this, I thought it was going to take me a lot longer. I mean, actually, maybe I haven't saved time. Maybe I spent a lot of time refactoring and building it at the beginning. So let's not say that just yet. I think it feels better now. It feels better like I can do more things now, but there was a long struggle to actually, a lot of refactoring and a lot of that. And again, that's the thing. I had made a lot of mistakes and things, and I'm sure there's a lot more to come, but I think I blocked a lot of them out once I tried to fix them. That's the thing. So yeah, definitely. I mean, for example, the card game, the baseball card game is actually totally separate from this now because it's done for a client. I didn't want to actually keep mixing things back and forth. That's that's their code and all that kind of stuff. And since then, that would probably actually be pretty incompatible with this now because I've made a lot of changes. But I am keeping the little animal game basically up to date with everything like that. But it is, yeah. Again, like I said, there's just things you do and you kind of you hit a brick wall of some kind and it's like, oh yeah. But again, I would have to probably look at my Subversion logs and look for the word like fix, refactor, unscrew, or whatever other words you want to put in there where basically I realized that something was wrong. So that happened a lot. It did totally happen a lot. But I'm actually pretty happy with where I can just work on this now. And it's, it's fun, that kind of stuff.
I also wonder, if you have a choice of what the next game is going to be. Well, I want to do this one, but this one worked really well with what I've already built. So.
Well, I think besides the RPG, there is a chance that I may be doing another kind of a game that I did a long time ago. I don't want to talk about it too much, but besides that, I would make little board games. I mean, I would just do little asynchronous board games and stuff like that, because that's my favorite kind of thing to do, is just like little strategy games and stuff like that. So it's probably when I do that, when I do the second board game, and I actually really grind it out, I'm going to find that my board game needs to be refactored a lot, and that's definitely going to happen. But you know, I did what I could in there to make it as much as possible. But I'm sure I'm going to have to change stuff. That's going to be, that's going to require some work, definitely, to do that.
Sounds like you got a good foundation.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty decent. Yeah, like I said, the thing is, I'm doing things in here that I definitely would not do if you have 100 people working on your team. You have to scale things up and be a lot more careful about stuff. You just can't do that. But I mean, most of these mobile things are like, 3 people for 3 months. You just don't have time to go do all this and rebuild the infrastructure every time and all that kind of junk. So yeah, it's definitely helpful for that kind of stuff.
Has it largely been yourself using this?
Yeah, I mean, what happened was I built the little animal game, the little Triple Town game myself, and then the RPG. I got a little bit of art. I don't like asking artists to work for free or for royalties or for marketing or whatever word we're using for. I want you to make art and I'm not going to pay you. So the little animal, I mean, you understand. I don't like doing that. So the animal game has 2D art. I know that. I know it's not animated. It's 2D art. Basically, that's what I could afford to do when I was doing that game. So, it's been made. The other game actually ended up with it where my stuff stopped at something called a service reference, WCF service reference, and they were doing all the actual database stuff. So I had like a long list of functions that I implemented, and then like change those into the objects that I had and stuff like that at that layer and other kinds of stuff. But they were doing that. So there's like a couple other people, 2 or 3 other people basically doing all that stuff in the background. Yeah, but so far it's mostly been me. Yeah. I mean, the RPG is really hard to get people I mean, how many people think that's crazy trying to do an RPG with a shared world? Anybody? Oh, come on, you're speaking polite. But that's the thing. It is pretty crazy. And generally, when I tell people that, it just doesn't go. I get this kind of they start backing up a little bit, stuff like that. It's been that way. I think once EverQuest Next comes out, I think they won't think it's so crazy because I think they're going to do a lot of that stuff in there. We'll see how that goes. And like I said, there's one other game called Dwarf Fortress, which is pretty insane, which does a lot of that. It's not like multiplayer, but it's basically a generated world, and there's essentially a lot of events happening that are stories and stuff like that. So you should maybe check it out and see what it's like. It's a text game. It's like an ASCII text game, like an old roguelike, essentially, that kind of stuff. But it's really deep. I mean, essentially, the way he's working on that is much more in depth. Like, I would never basically try and simulate like pieces of your arm or something like that, broken bones. But he's really going down to that level of doing all these things. But there's so much crazy stuff in that game. It's like a roguelike with so much extra stuff in it. Essentially, it's pretty amazing anyway. So, yeah.
Well, then I was actually going to ask sort of more of a game design question on that point. I mean, you said most of the games you like making are these super simple, like puzzle kind of board game type things. But then also at the same time, you're trying to build this procedural RPG, which is very different in terms of level of complexity and whatnot. So, I mean, do you feel like there's some kind of similarity there between those two things that draws you to both of them, even though on the surface they seem really different?
I think the RPG is just going to sort of be a labor of love, and I don't think it's actually ever going to launch. Mm-hmm. I would say that, but the little board games are doable. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's like you can actually make something, and I love systems. Like, I don't really make a distinction between systems design and gameplay programming. Essentially, it's more like a continuum of figuring out how all the pieces interact with each other and what the rules are and all that kind of stuff. I really consider that to be a continuum. Like, you really do have to know something about like programming or some of that in order to really do system design and stuff like that. So I think the little games are actually just things that I can actually do, essentially. But they are interesting in a smaller way. But it's more like one-off. Like it's like a problem you can actually solve, I guess, in a certain amount of time, rather than just something that you're just going to pick away at as you go, essentially. So just different kinds of things, I guess.
And if you seem really committed to the idea of being sort of like full stack, both programmer and also doing the server side stuff, doing the client stuff, and then also doing a lot of the design as well. But then you also obviously said like you don't want to kind of be your own company and like do your
what's happening is that I'm basically do contracting off and on to make money.
Yeah.
Essentially that's what it is. And but I just like working on this stuff. I mean, it's just very hard for me to.
When you say contract, you mean like freelance work?
Yes, freelance work. Basically, yeah, like, you know, per week or something like that for periods of time. Like you need an app built or something like that. Do that kind of stuff. Yeah, it doesn't. I don't care what it is. Actually, I mean, it can be regular apps because basically, building servers and tools is basically building regular apps. So, you know, if you're willing to do that kind of stuff, that's fine. No, it's basically, I hate asking people to work for free. I have a real problem with that. So there's stuff I want to do, but I want to pay for it. I mean, it's just one of the, there could be a situation someday where it's like, you know, you're talking with people and you all have a great idea. We're all going to go do this and we're going to work for 6 months and we're going to get funding and all that. That's a different kind of a thing. But on little things where it's just basically something cool I want to do, I just figure I'm going to have to do it myself. So, except for the art. So I don't know, just kind of go with that, I guess. I just have a problem with that. So yeah. So, I mean, please pay artists. Please pay them for what they do. I mean, it's so bad. I mean, I get that they're desperate, but it's so mean. Anyway, I have a lot of artist friends. They actually like me, which is weird because I'm a programmer. I mean, I do give them some crap, but you know, it's they just punch me, so it's fine.
Yeah, if you're trying to feed them, which most other people are.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. I really try and do that. It's just very because they complain to me so much about that. Anyway, that's just the thing.
So anyone else have any questions?
I just wanted to say, if you haven't tried his cute animal game, I downloaded it yesterday and I've played it an embarrassingly number of times.
Yeah, it's pretty fun.
It's a lot of fun.
I like it, but again, it's a triple town mechanic is really good. I admit that I ripped off a really good mechanic to do that. All the games I want to do, actually all the little board games, are take a mechanic that exists and kind of rip it off and make it an asynchronous multiplayer, which essentially means take a game that you would normally have and give each side a bunch of moves so that you feel like your turn is worth something. Essentially, that's my big secret for what I think you want to do with mobile asynchronous gaming.
I never heard of either of them. I went back and after I played yours and liked it a lot to that triple whatever. I tried it. I liked yours a lot better.
Well, I mean, it's a different game. I mean, I like Triple Town too. I'm just not very good at it. Triple Town is actually really unforgiving and hard, I think. Like I said, there are very few people who are really good at it. If you've played the game, there is one guy who has gotten like tens of millions of points in that game, and you've probably died at like 100. Well, I died at like 100,000. So it's not good, but it is what it is. Yeah.
Cool. Well, thanks again, and I guess we can.